Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Rudy's Bombay, an era of cosmopolitanism. My name is Asad Lalji. I'm the CEO of Avid Learning. This evening is a celebration of Rima Gihai's recently published book, The Catalyst, Rudy von Leyden's and India's Artistic Awakening. Rudy von Leyden first arrived in Bombay in the early 1930s and quickly became enchanted by the vibrant energy and the spirit of the city's art scene. As an art critic for the Times of India and as associate editor of Marg magazine, he became a tireless champion for the experimental Indian artists challenging traditions. He was the progressive artist groups in Bombay that truly captured von Leyden's passion. His incisive criticism and advocacy helped elevate their work onto national and international stages. More than just a promoter, von Leyden facilitated direct support, whether it was the legal defense of Akbar Padamsi or the financial help for artists like Ara. In choosing Bombay over Berlin, the art world over geology, Rudi committed himself wholeheartedly to fostering India's artists through his advocacy, patronage, direction in their practice, and finding their place and identity in a newly independent India. To commemorate Rudy's contribution to Bombay's yesteryears, we have a distinguished panel today. These esteemed guests have all been part of Avid programs before, and as we continue our creative collaboration with their diverse backgrounds and perspectives, our panel will help us unearth nuances of Rudy's life, his unparalleled passion for the arts, and the transformative era that he ushered in modern art of India. Before we begin, a special thanks to the director of the NGMA Mumbai, Shri Umesh Kumar Rastogi, and the deputy director of the NGMA Mumbai, Shruti Das, for hosting us here today. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our panel of experts, art historian and writer, Dr. Firoza Godrej, gallerist and co-founder Chatterjee and Lal, Mortimer Chatterjee, artistic director, QTP Entertainment, and co-director, Literature Live, Kwasar Thakur Padamsi, and our moderator for the evening, whose book on Rudi served as the impetus for this evening's discussion, editor Art India and author, Rima Desai Gihai. Rima will make a short presentation, following which the panel will join her on stage. Look forward to a wonderful discussion, and thank you all for being here in such great numbers and braving the rain. Thank you.
Thank you, Asad, and thank you, Avid, for hosting this wonderful panel discussion this evening. Like Asad mentioned, I'll make a short presentation before I invite the esteemed panel to come on stage and discuss the Bombay in which Rudi thrived in and what allowed him to thrive in that cosmopolitan Bombay. So here we go. 1930s, Hugo Baumgartner is a Firangi wherever he goes. Too dark for Hitler's Germany, too fair for India. Escaping the Nazi regime, but losing his parents to it, the wandering Jew builds a life in India only to be interrupted by war and then partition, and finally finds a home in the multifaceted Bombay. Another part Jewish man arrives in India around the same time, 1933. Barely 25 then, Rudi had just completed his PhD thesis in geology from the University of Göttingen. Rudi's father, Victor von Leyden, was a Christian. Though a baptized Christian herself, Rudi's mother, Louise von Leyden, came from Jewish ancestry. Rudi's Jewish legacy meant that life in Germany, with Adolf Hitler being appointed as the chancellor, was under threat, and this was only made worse by his communist political leanings. The family thought it would be wise of him to head to Bombay, where his elder brother Albrecht von Leyden had preceded him in India by 6 years. Albrecht worked with IG Farben, a German conglomerate of 8 leading chemical manufacturers. Bombay was a stark contrast to the growing turmoil in Germany. The rise of Nazism and the onset of its anti-Semitic pogrom appeared to have little impact on British-occupied India, not even among the German community in Bombay, governed by Consul Cap. Unlike many European Jewish refugees who sought asylum or stopped en route to Shanghai, Rudi's arrival in the Indian shores wasn't dictated by strange fate. It was the result of a well thought out, convenient plan. A swarm of warm air and the intoxicating smell of the sea greeted Rudy's arrival at the Bombay harbour in June 1933. Rudi lived with Albrecht in a bungalow at 17 Pali Hill with expansive views of the Arabian Sea. Albrecht worked in the bustling Fort district of Bombay and had selected Pali Hill for its cooler climate and the tranquility compared to the city centre. Dara Gandhi, a longtime Bombay resident, remembered Pali Hill as a tree-lined suburb with numerous bungalows, tennis courts, and a golf club. Albrecht had a corporate job, but Rudi did not want to depend on his elder brother's benevolence. As an amateur artist, Rudi began using his skills to design advertisements, posters, invitation cards, and menus for friends. Encouraged by these initial successes and some monetary help from new friends he made, Rudi set up an advertising studio called the Han Commercial Arts Studio almost a year into his arrival in Bombay. It is at the 72 Customs House Road, a small nugget. It is, I think, in the same building as the Shantanu and Nikhil store today. In a letter addressed to his mother in July 1935, Rudi had expressed his desire to pursue art, but felt torn since he had spent more than a decade training in geology and found himself at a crossroads. Besides, all expectations to finding a job in a field he had been trained in left him deeply disappointed. To illustrate this conundrum, he doodled a man looking at two signboards, one directing him towards geology and the other to art. As luck would have it, Rudi's talent for drawing was noticed by Simon Pereira, the then editor of the Evening News of India, who published his sports cartoons in the newspaper. The illustration happened to be of a rather crucial hockey match at the Cooperage ground. The city's sports enthusiasts turned up in large numbers to watch the Sahibs 11 battle out the Ladies 11 in the first ever hockey match of its kind. The captain of the Bombay Gymkhana Ladies 11 was none other than Rudi's sister. She started the first women hockey team at the Bombay Gymkhana. Victoria had previously played hockey for the women's team in Berlin, but was barred from the German national team because of her Jewish heritage. Bombay was her great escape. In addition to hockey, Victoria was passionate about horse riding. Considering her stature, Albrecht, on your right, even purchased a smaller horse for her, allowing all three siblings to ride together on numerous hunting trips. Impressed with this skill as a cartoonist, Stanley Jespin offered to publish a series of Rudi's cartoons on Bombay clubs. Stanley also encouraged Rudi initially to create cartoons for the Illustrated Weekly of India on the political climate in the world and Hitler's reign in Germany. Rudi made Hitler the target of most of his cartoons during the war. His cartoons, spread across 4 columns, held pride of place in the newspaper. He created these cartoons using the moniker Denley, an anagram of his surname Leyden, to ensure that his family back home didn't face the consequences of the Nazis because of his political views. Meanwhile, Rudi became a regular at the Times layout department, where he worked part-time too. Fellow expatriates in the office and the brilliant Frank Morris, who'd go on to become the first Indian editor of the Times of India, and others, Rudi formed a gang and lived it up in then Bombay. The group held animated discussions through long nights, attended the cinema, feasted on scrumptious fare, including Mughlai Murgi at George on Apollo Street, and the Star of Asia, another popular joint at the time on busy Sandhurst Road. They also viewed art shows at the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel. One such evening in June, Rudi stumbled upon an exhibition at the Taj that would eventually change not only the course of his life, but also the trajectory of the Indian modern art. He spoke so passionately about the art show that Simon Pereira, the then editor of the Evening News of India, who had previously noticed Rudi's talent for drawing and published his cartoons regularly in the newspaper, felt compelled to ask, "Why don't you review for the show for the paper?" Rudy von Leyden, the art critic, was born. On 11 June 1938, the Evening News of India published a review by RVL titled Indian Art on View at the Taj Mahal Hotel. The works on display were a collection of pictures, drawings, and paintings by two brothers, Sarada and Ranada Ukil, who were students at the art school in Delhi. Back home, war was looming over Europe. Both Rudi and Albrecht, his brother, who had sought British citizenship, agreed that their parents should relocate to Bombay until the situation normalized. Rudi's naturalization certificate, yeah. Times were uncertain, but the Leydens' Bombay was antithetical to Hugo Baumgartner's Bombay, the beleaguered protagonist of writer Anita Desai's telling 1988 novel Baumgartner's Bombay. Hugo, a Jewish man who endured the tyranny of the Second World War in Germany and later suffered in internment camps in India, spent his final years wandering the city's streets. He searched for tablescapes at tea shops and restaurants, a testament to the city's dark, gritty side revealed through Hugo's story. In contrast, the Leydens' Bombay was anything but unforgiving. A glimpse into his mother Louise's diary notes confirms this. She described Bombay as a poor Europe with its beautiful gardens. In Louis Bromfield's 1939 book Night in Bombay, the American character made a striking comparison of the two Bombays that existed concurrently. Yes, Bombay was fantastic and romantic, and extraordinary things happened there if you didn't notice the coolies, the women, and the children sleeping on sidewalks and in gutters as you drove home from a good party about sunrise. Needless to say, the Leydens integrated with the fantastic side of Bombay, and art remained a binding factor. In 1948, Pa Leyden, Victor, Ma Leyden, Louis, and their three sons, Albrecht and Rudolf, held a show together. Victor made wooden sculptures. The mother made watercolors. She was a student of Walter Langhammer. Albrecht created beautiful oil paintings, and Rudi presented his political cartoons. The proceeds from the sale went towards setting up Artist Center in Kala Ghoda, considered the art district of Bombay back then. Now let me speak to you about the two other emigres whom trailblazer Keiko Gandhi called Hitler's bounty to India. Along with Rudi, two other expatriates helped in shaping Indian modern art. There was Walter Langhammer, standing to your left, and Emanuel Schlesinger, to your extreme right standing, who escaped the Second World War and made Bombay their home. Langhammer, a fine painter, became the art director with the Times of India, and Schlesinger owned a pharmaceutical company, became one of the biggest patrons of the Bombay Progressive Artist Group. Aside of being a critic, Rudi was a friend, mentor, and guide to the Bombay Progressive Artist Group that was formed in 1947, and he was responsible for shaping many careers. Artists K.H. Ara, along with fellow artists S.H. Raza and F.N. Souza, founded the group on the eve of India's independence. The three inducted one artist each. Raza invited Hari Ambadas Gade, and Souza got the iconoclastic Maqbool Fida Hussain, and Ara brought on board painter and sculptor Sadanand Bakre. The late Vienna-based art patron Eleanor Harbel Chaudhary had heard from Rudi that he in fact first met Ara when the latter worked as a car cleaner. Eleanor recalled, Rudi was aware that Ara was a car washer, but when he realized that Ara also painted, he wanted to see his work. To Ara, this was a huge deal that a European Bada Sahab was interested in seeing his work. When Rudi saw how beautifully Ara painted, he bought him material and encouraged him to continue painting. Krishan Khanna believes the artist's idea of modernism, albeit their own, was still quite European, and that influence came from the French and the three individuals, Langhammer, Leyden, and Schlesinger, who inspired the group. They showed them images of work that were created in Europe and exposed them to literature and catalogues. Painters whose influence predominated those times in Bombay were Picasso, Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, and Henri Matisse. There was another artist who became a cornerstone of Rudi's esteemed cultural circles. Rudi married Nena Pilantini, a Hungarian artist who came to India in 1948. She came from a well-known Hungarian family with German origin who lost everything during the war. Rudi and Nena got married in 1949 and lived at an apartment at Nepean Road. Together, they supported artists and mentored them through resources and dialogue. Rudi, by then, had joined the Volkart brothers, which later became Voltas, in 1954 as a publicity manager. His dynamic corporate role enabled him to sponsor artists and their work. In fact, Rudi's cabin at Voltas turned into a makeshift viewing room of sorts. During his spare time, artists such as Hussein, Ara, Guy Tonde, and Heber, still finding their way in the art world, would drop in to show Rudi their new works, which were modestly priced between 500 and 700 rupees. He allowed the artists to leave their works in the office in case anyone wished to buy them. Now, this is something we'll explore in depth during our panel discussion. When he retired from Voltas in 1968, to find a niche of the same kind was difficult. That kind of job was now being occupied by Indians. The Indianization program had started. To express their gratitude, they decided that each artist would gift a self-portrait as an expression of how he allowed to see themselves. That's Ara, Guy Tonde, Raza's self-portrait, Raiba, Prafulla Joshi, later Dhanukar. Rudi by then was married to his second wife, Lucy. He unfortunately lost Nena to cancer in 1964. Lucy and Rudi together worked with several charitable causes. They were in fact part of the effort to help Nirmala Niketan of College of Home Science with some fundraising activities in 1967. An anecdote I learned from the late Jocelyn Dacuna, whom I had the privilege of meeting during my research. Needless to say, several farewell parties and tearful goodbye dinners were held in his honor. Before finding suitable homes for his paintings, Rudi displayed them at the Artist Center as a gesture to engage with the city and his work. A quote that I read in an essay he wrote in 1979 remained with me, and I reckon that it pretty much sums up his time in India. I came to India on a 6-month visit and stayed 35 years. I liked the country and its people from the word go. But I know now that my first attitudes were very Sahib, and that friendships begin where and when the Sahib disappears. And now, let us unravel this quote over a panel discussion. May I please invite Dr. Firoza Godrej, Mortimer Chatterjee, and Kwasar Thakur Padamsi to join me. Wow, that's a full house. Thank you. Thank you for being here on this rainy evening. Well, and thank you, Dr. Godrej, Kwasar, Mortimer, for being here and engaging in this conversation. One of the aspects that I wanted to touch upon, and I didn't mention in the presentation for the sake of time, was that all of these artists and Rudi especially met many of the theater practitioners, poets, musicians, and I remember when I had met Geev Patel, he had described Rudi as a Catholic mind, a Renaissance mind, who was not just particularly interested in visual art, but actually in the cultural aspect of Bombay, in the philanthropic aspect of Bombay, in all the aspects of Bombay that I think has become now working in these silos. And one of the spaces that allowed this dialogue to happen was the Bhulabai Desai Memorial Institute. And before we touch upon that, I knew you mentioned you knew Rudi and Nena as friends of your parents. So if you can just share a bit of your impressions about him and them being this social couple that you had mentioned.
I'm not as old as Rudi and don't claim to be either. But as you mentioned in your opening remarks, they were an extremely outgoing and social couple, both Rudi and Nena, and there are many people in the audience today whose parents knew them or they themselves knew them and will vouch for that. It started with, my parents were close to Walcott House, and Peter and Paul Reinhardt were visitors whenever they came to India to my parents' home. One of the managing directors, a very fine, refined man by the name of Mr. Sri Krishna Handu, S.K. Handu, was also very much part of Volta's. And that is how the introduction started of them coming over informally to have dinner with us. As children, we were not allowed to stay up for very long, but we had to politely dress up, meet our parents' guests, and then disappear. But the stories continued long after, as you very rightly said. Dinner parties went on quite late. Entertaining was generally done on weekends. Entertaining in clubs persisted, whether it was golf or swimming, throughout the week. And dinner invitations were formally sent out as a dinner card. I mean, you just didn't ring up people. There was no WhatsApp. So my parents had this card, and you just filled in the names of the guests, and you already had the address, and you put in the date. There were not many places to go to in public except the Taj at that time, the Ambassador later, and sorry, I beg your pardon. Can you hear now? Yeah, okay, I'll look this way as well. So invitations went out, and that's how they started coming home. But more importantly than that, my association started with the artists who you mentioned in your opening remarks at the Bhulabai. 89 Bhulabai Desai Road was the home of Dhirubai and Madhuriben Desai, and it was called Warden Road, and that whole area was just generally referred to as Breach Candy because of the breach. And there I really learned about a lot of things, not only about the art world, and by that time I was a young teenager, but also about the theatre and the music activities that used to take place there, the Indian music activities at BMI, Bhulabai Memorial Institute. And of course the Desai family lived there, and their great friend and colleague was Soli Batliwala, who some of you may remember went on to become the honorary secretary at the Jahangir Art Gallery for many, many years. And that's how it all started. I'll end here, and you can ask the others on the panel some questions. Of course, we had Mr. Al-Qazi there, and Mr. And Ravi Shankar and Annapurna. It was long before the NCPA came into Akash, when the old Bhulabai was pulled down and Akash Ganga came up, and then the second floor, as many of you remember, was rented out by Madhuri Desai to J.R.D. Tata for ₹1 a year for 5 years until they built the NCPA at Nariman Point.
Right. Kwasar, I had the privilege of meeting your father in 2018 and interviewing him, regarding this book. And I learned of that Rudy's, at his nephew James's attic in the UK, there was a play that Volta's had done as a farewell to Rudi. And one of the lines was that every time a new actress approaches Rudi, he sends them either, if he'll gauge whether are they into the Al-Qazi kind of theater or the Padamsi kind of theater. And that's when I learned that yes, there is a theater connection here. And I promptly reached out to your father, and he was like, he is the person who actually told me, Padamsi, why are you so obsessed with Tennessee Williams and Edward Albee? When are you going to create your own plays? And that's what inspired him to create this a play that he was not very proud of, the Bandra Saturday Night. and wherein he got together this group of people and said that let's speak in a Bandra lingo. Of course, the priests in Bandra were not happy with that play, and it was a very mediocre play, he said. But he said that's what sparked the interest, and that's when he started exploring writers such as Partap Sharma, and they had created this play, The Word. He also shared bumping into him every now and then at the Budhabai Desai Institute. I mean, I know you have learned a fountain of stories from him, and if you can just share a few, that would set a context to what that era was at that time.
I think, excuse me. I think it's an interesting kind of thing, because in unlike with the art world where Rudi is held in huge kind of estimation, the theatre world doesn't really clock him in the same way. And part of that is obviously because the way that he was supporting artists like Raza and stuff in an incredible way to kind of find their own voice, and to all these guys, and this works for the theatre playwrights and the theatre directors of the time as well, the Alkazis and the Alex and the Jersons and even Bobby before that. They were all very influenced by what was happening in the Western canon. And then they were bringing that work and then remounting it in different ways. So whether you're talking about Strindberg or Tennessee Williams or Arthur Miller. And I think what was happening within the art world was very interesting, because all these guys had studied abroad. And I think their knee-jerk reaction was to try and recreate, and then bit by bit they all found their own voice or their own style. And I think people like Rudi were very, very important in trying to change the lens of what it meant to a newly independent India. I mean, Bombay, I think, at least from everything I've read, was a slightly strange city in the fact that independence and partition didn't quite work the same way as it worked everywhere else. The sense of nationalism was slightly different. And I say this in a slight way. I mean, Bombay's been a kind of silo in very many ways, maybe because it's a port town, it's been a harbor town for so long. The influences that come in and out are very, very different. And we didn't quite, I don't think as a city we responded in the same way as the anti-colonial way as most other cities had responded. And particularly in the art world, I think it took us a little bit of time to kind of figure out, hey, actually we can tell our own stories and tell them in different ways. And I think, I mean, there was the Sultan Padamsee Writing Award, which was actually started as a movement to get young Indian writers to start writing, and Dina Mehta and Gurcharan Das and all of that were among that first thing, and it still exists, and Poo's here who runs it now. And these were all kind of things which were about trying to find an identity and trying to say, hey, we can, who are we in the larger scheme of things? And I think, I mean, it's lovely you started with the Budhabai Desai Institute, because that was such a melting pot of all the arts. And in a strange way, so was Rudi, kind of a melting pot of all the arts, in the fact that he was constantly watching theatre and connecting with Alkazi and you know, working on art shows and attending music performances and constantly cross-pollinating between these. And I think, as you so lovelily say in the book, he started as the outsider that suddenly became, no, we don't want to look at just what's happening in Europe or just what's happening elsewhere. What are the new forms and the new ways that things can happen? And he started supporting that. And I think that kind of had a knock-on effect. In fact, in a strange way, I think the art world generally was much more influenced by each other than it is now. By art world, I mean the arts world, the theatre, music. I think now we're much more silo-related. I think at that time, everyone was kind of pro-am. They were all amateurs working at a professional level, so there was much more camaraderie. There was much more, I mean, the Budhabai Institute is a great example, because you had Ravi Shankar rehearsing in one corner, you had Alkazi rehearsing in another room, you had Hussain painting in a third room, and there was constant cross-pollination that happened. And I think Rudi was one of the people that kind of lit that spark where there can be cross-pollination. You can learn from anything and everywhere. But yeah, I think that's what kind of was the pebble that started rolling down. And just to importantly say, this was particularly writing in English for the English theatre. There's a huge canon of work that happened in other languages and stuff like that. But I think like Rudi's little nudge kind of started everyone thinking, hey, you know, maybe we can tell our own stories in English, which is the language that we also speak. And how do you claim, and Bandra Saturday Night was about claiming English as an Indian language and speaking English as Indians speak.
Truly. I think another lovely anecdote that Vijaya Mehta had shared with me about Bhulabhai Desai Memorial Institute when I was researching on this book was that she had actually Guy Tonde, now considered one of the biggest artists that the country has produced, had painted her set, her backdrop for her. She had Kishori Amorkar rehearsing in the next room. She invited her to create the music. And then there was Al-Qazi, who was her mentor. And you're right. I mean, the fact that this space existed, it became this melting pot for, all these artists to band together and create work. Another strong influence of Rudi was that of corporate patronage. The fact that he discovered Ara, he discovered the works of Raza, but also nudged fellow colleagues at Volkart Brothers, later Voltas, to buy their work. He also encouraged Kawasji Jahangir and Dr. Homi Baba to buy Ara's work because he didn't want him to go back to washing cars. And it just came from this need to help. But there, I know, Mott, you're quite interested, and we've often discussed about, corporate patronage and the whole aspect of art being shared in public, private spaces. And you've been instrumental in documenting the TIFR collection, where Rudi played an instrumental role. If you could share a little bit about your research, that would be
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Rima, and thank you for writing this book, which I mean has been so long coming, and it really fulfills, I think, a great need in the art historical record, which was really a big lacuna in terms of his role generally within the art sphere, but also, as we're hearing, more within the arts and culture, and in the broader arts ecosystem. So thank you.
Thank you.
What I would say is when we talk about this idea of cross-pollination, I find that very interesting when we're thinking about this moment of especially in the post-independence moment. When I'm talking about the visual arts, we're of course presented with this idea of the progressive artist group as this new revolutionary moment in visual arts in India. My take for some time has been something other than that in fact what we have in many senses is a continuation of a particular kind of attitude towards art in Bombay that merely finds new energy perhaps in the post-independence moment. But in fact it's not a question of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it is in fact a question of building on what had already come before within the Bombay context. So in that regard, this idea of cross-pollination becomes really important because in fact it was people talking cross-generationally, it was people talking across borders as well and in an international setting. And these conversations then, yes, create what comes then in the 1950s and 1960s. And I feel a figure like von Leyden is very much a product of an evolution rather than a revolution in terms of what happens in Bombay in this key period. And when we talk about him in this holistic sense, I think it starts making sense. And on the cover of your book is, of course, the famous portrait of von Leyden by Walter Langhammer. And in fact, this is a detail of that painting. The entire painting shows von Leyden holding up what? Not a piece of contemporary art, but a piece of classical sculpture, a relief of some kind from perhaps the 15th, 16th century. And von Leyden himself, of course, is a great proponent of the classical arts. He goes on to be a world expert, as you describe in your book, of playing cards from India. This is his deep love, his deep passion. So here is a connoisseur in a different sense from a revolutionary art critic wanting to necessarily change the terms upon which we're thinking about the arts, but rather developing and building on the shoulders of giants who came before. And that is what he then brings to the corporate art collections that he helps. So where Homi Bhabha in 1954 is starting to build the collection of TIFR, the campus is going to be built by 1962, so there's sort of an 8-year period in which Bhabha, von Leyden, he brings Kalkanda Lavala, he brings Mrs. Feroza Vadia, Pipsi Vadia on board. These are, so to speak, the insiders who are building the art collection for what becomes perhaps the most important museum quality art collection in India at that time. But it's very much a product of seeing these small networks within the Bombay art scene coming together to create something like TIFR. For me, what's most exciting is that it's not the vision of one eye. It's the vision of multiple people who are talking to each other, conversing with each other. And that really, for me, is the most important legacy of a collection like TIFR. And it's something that we see all too rarely, sadly, in the contemporary context.
Right. Around the same time, Air India and later the Taj Hotel also built their collections. And you've often described them as gold standard of corporate art collections. What promoted corporates to turn to art to tell the new India story? And what was the historical, economic, social factors made the atmosphere of Bombay so conducive to it?
So, I mean, you've mentioned Taj, Air India, TIFR. There's
Godrej collection.
Godrej. But with the first three, of course, there's one common factor, right, which is the Tatars. And the Tatar family is, of course, J.R.D. Tatar is an interesting individual in himself. I think that his main contribution to the visual arts is allowing others to think out of the box. I wouldn't say he himself was necessarily propelled by any deep engagement with contemporary art, but I think he was able to put the right people in the right place to actually make those decisions, whether it was Air India, whether it was Taj, of course, Mrs. Soni, or Mrs. Elizabeth Kerker, who went and then made these decisions. Why is that time so important? Clearly, it's in the early 1960s. This is the moment of industrialization, of young India promoting itself, using art certainly as a soft power tool to think about the way in which we could then export Indian culture internationally. And of course, there is an incipient art market. We have Shireen here. So by 1964, 65, we have art galleries who were then promoting art actively, Feroza by 1971, 72. And of course, what's happening is then the slightly feudal, if I may say, relationship between artists and collectors. You've mentioned on a couple of occasions the Rudy von Leyden and the nurturing of someone like Ara. Let's not mince words. There's clearly a hierarchy which is at play in those relationships, which doesn't necessarily put the artist in a particularly strong relationship with the collector. Once galleries are in place, they are able to promote artists in a fashion and give them a sort of a visibility that may not have been possible prior. So in that way, art and contemporary art really becomes very much part of the contemporary discourse of that moment I think within dinner party situations, social situations, you want to be part of the current discourse, and it was visual arts. So naturally then it becomes part of, I think, any serious corporate's idea around self or self-visibility, wanting to think of themselves of a certain standard. On art collection was sort of, this is something you must have. So I think it was almost a natural part of one's being at that moment in time.
Mrs. Godrej, like, what was the era of Bombay like at that time? Like, just to continue from what Mott's just said, that allowed the promotion of the arts.
It was the artists themselves, I think, initially. I think the very first gallery that came up was in the Bulabai, Gallery 59, which Bal Chabra started. And he himself was a painter, and he had exhibitions of his colleagues. And they banded together very well. I mean, the one thing that really struck me about artists and corporates is the Akbar Padamsi exhibition. The very first exhibition that Akbar had at the Jahangir Art Gallery, he had to close after 2 days because there was an inspector in this area, and correct me if I'm wrong, his name was Mr. Kanga.
Mr. Kanga, yes.
Who went in there and said, you have to shut this show because you are showing obscenity. It was a beautiful painting called The Lovers. We've seen it in several art books and publications, and now in auction houses as well. And Akbar was a young artist who had come out. He's not part of the progressive group. But I had a conversation with him once, and there was subsequently a publication on him by Marg, another important person with the others who helped in influencing Rudi and communicating with him was Dr. Mulkraj Anand of Marg Publications, because that started in 47, Modern Artist Research Group. That's what stands acronym for Marg. And Akbar defended himself. Akbar came from a different background from all the others. He was not, he didn't have to paint signboards. He didn't have to clean cars. He was sent by his brother, elder brother, to study in Paris. And he was telling me, I said, Akbar, what inspired you to paint this subject? He said, it's all around you. Can't you see it in the museum? And that's exactly what he did. I believe the court adjourned, and the judge was taken to the Prince of Wales Museum to show Krishna and Radha, Shiv and Parvati, Uma and Vasudev, all in the sculpture from our temple architecture. He said, what is wrong with this? I'm just showing in a contemporary way a man and a woman, and it's in the mind of the viewer, placing a man's hand on a woman's breast. There's nothing obscene about that. And actually, it was Rudi, none of them, nobody supported him in that case. Who supported him? On the morning of the case, von Leyden said, go ahead, we are going to back you. And you stand in that court, and I think he was not as yet a critic in the Times of India, but we will support you. And people like that came out and defended these artists. So the artists were supporting themselves. Patronage came much later, Rima. And Ara was from today we call, I never ever thought of Ara as a Dalit. Never. As long as he lived and he had dinner at our table, as indeed he had dinner in many Bombay homes, and never ever felt that way with him. So there was a different kind of evolution of patronage and where it came from. And I think it was the artists who supported the artists, and we only had Jahangir Art Gallery in 52, I beg your pardon, Bajpai built it for Sir Kawasji Jahangir, and Artist Center. And later on, Taj very wisely decided to have a gallery, thanks to JRD's sister, Mrs. Ruda Besani. And then you mentioned Elizabeth Kerker, who helped build the Taj collection. So it was almost a decade later that this started. And before that it was, and you know, there was this great rivalry between Western India and J.J. School of Art and the artists who had the good fortune of going abroad, and Eastern India with the Shantiniketan and the Jamini Roy school that came up. But they held their own, and I think Bombay, the PAG group, the Progressive Artists Group, also held their own. But it was the artists initially, and then came the patronage, and then came the commercial success of these artists over the years. They were very, I won't call them angry young men, but Gaitonde was very angry young man. I mean, he had family issues, and how he went through JJ school and how he came. He took shelter at the Bulabai. Mrs. Desai actually gave him a place to sleep, and that was her one room. Studios are open. They should never be locked, because she was very worried what would happen behind a locked door. And she said anybody can go into anybody's room. Shami Mehmet could play with Ravi Shankar, Allah Rakha would come. They could stay 24/7 and perform and dance, but everybody had to share that space equally. Performing artists, plastic artists, dancers, everyone. And I remember, you know, this. I didn't know who Gaitonde was, but he was a very shy and angry, all the time angry. The nicest thing about him was he had very happy friends, like Prafulla Joshi Dhanukar, bubbly, and you know, that sort of thing. But they supported each other tremendously. And then came the patronage or the critics, etc. And don't forget poetry. Nissim Ezekiel was one of them. You know, he was really befriended by Mr. Al-Qazi. They all he took them all generously to the UK. Souza, Nissim, Mr. Al-Qazi, Padamsi, of course, went. Raza in Paris. I'll stop there.
Speaking of corporate patronage, one of the aspects that, again, your father shared with me was Voltas, in order to support theatre, would give them like some, you know, allow them to publish their ads in the magazine, and then often sponsor some of their shows. You know, how did the spirit in visual arts, parallel developments in theatre and performance in that era?
Well, I mean, how we long for the time where the corporates were giving money to the arts. We look blissfully back. But no, I think I think a lot was happening at that time, and I think it was kind of the bubbling over. I mean, literally when you read about all the painters that were coming out right now, something like that is going to make an impact across genres. You think of all the poets that were coming out at that time. And all of them, at least for some point, had another job, right? They were all working in advertising agencies, in the art department, or doing something or the other. Rudi himself started off in advertising before he switched. And all these people were doing other things. So I think their networks were much, much larger. I mean, I love the fact that Rudi forced everyone in Voltas to buy stuff, and would, you know, people would actually turn up because of him, and do that. And at that time, maybe they weren't very happy. But then when you've owned a Hussein for 500 rupees at one point, I think right now you're kind of, you know, it was a worthy investment. But I think that's also the building of an arts economy. And I use that word very interestingly, because you have to get people into the habit of valuing what you're seeing. And the same thing happens to ticket sales, for example, within the theatre. And today Bombay fortunately does have a ticket buying public. And that all kind of started around about that time, where people were willing to pay to see work, to see an Al-Qazi work on a terrace where you've climbed 4 floors, you know. And they were, but you had to buy a ticket, and I think everyone, because it was new and interesting work happening at the time, and they valued what they were placing on that, and they were all, I mean, Hussein designed a set for Al-Qazi, but nobody really knew who Hussein was at the time, right? But there's still that power that they believed that what they did had value, And I think that it was all happening around the 50s and the 60s in Bombay, and happening on across all fronts. So whether it was the poets, whether it was the artists, whether it was the playwrights, whether it was the theatre makers, I think it was quite a vibrant, exciting time for all the stuff that was new that was happening. And again, just like Firoza said, it was happening here, and it had nothing to do with what was happening in the East, or it was almost in counter to what was happening anywhere else. It was just it was an absolute product of what this city is. And I think people like Rudi and you know the other guys who came across, and a lot of other people who came at that time. I mean, in a way, it was quite wonderful that Rudi was, quote unquote, almost a refugee when he came, because he had that outsider's perspective. He was looking at something. He'd seen what nationalism or overt nationalism does. So then, how does that become free? How do you free the artist from that? He still had the communist leanings, and that, of course, particularly within the theatre, was very, very strong even here. So I think that it was almost like the perfect kind of thing. But the interesting thing, at least from everything that that's in your book, is Rudi loved to make organizations. Every third page, he started another organization or another center, or he's helped, make something else. And I think that was very important, because the first time I was like, man, that's a lot of, things that are being founded. And then you realize that nothing was there. They were all being founded for the first time. So then that suddenly becomes very, very valuable, because you're putting structures in place. And that can only happen if it's an outside eye. The artist working can't put a group together in that way, because they're trying to do their work. But someone outside can see a pattern emerging and suddenly says, hey, we can put some structure into this that will help. So the artist center or all the other things that got founded, and through...
It's interesting you picked that up, because for the longest time the working title of the book was The Outsider's Gaze, and then the publisher was like, what is this title? Anyway, but yeah, Mott, in your research, like, with TIFR and Taj collection, we often talk about, and as Keku Gandhi would call, Hitler's bounty to India, with Schlesinger, Langhammer, and Leyden coming in, and they literally had all the literature, all the catalogs. These are pre-Google days, so one didn't know what was being created in Europe at that time. And these men had all the literature. And, as Krishan Khanna also says, there's the idea of modernism, which is, yes, Indian, but there's the influences quite European, if you look closely. In your research and, with the TIFR and Taj, how do you make sense of the influence of these three men?
And the idea of the indigenous versus influences from outside India, is that?
Yes.
Yeah. When you were speaking, you were talking about Nina von Leyden. So Nina von Leyden, who passed quite young, was also an artist and made work. And interestingly, the few works that I've come across in the TIFR collection are indeed pencil sketches of dancers, apsaras from perhaps the Ajanta caves or some...
They would often take off to Ajanta, Ellora and Elephanta caves on weekends, and she'd spend her afternoon sketching.
Makes a lot of sense. So this is the kind of cultural milieu in which von Leyden, Schlesinger and Langhammer were operating. So whilst you're absolutely right to say that they were bringing a great deal of, a lot of interesting information and knowledge from outside India, I think that they were fully invested in a longer arc of art history within the country, and were deeply interested in making sure that whatever happened to the art scene, in a sense, as I said earlier, built on what had happened. And so what had happened before? We were talking about the schism between Western India and Eastern India. We're talking there really between the Bombay revival school in Bombay in Western India, and then the Bengal school in Eastern India. This is the context out of which then the Progressive Artists Group is operating. We do have patronage prior to independence, but that patronage, of course, is mainly state level patronage. So in 1929, Rashtrapati Bhavan, Lutyens' Delhi is built, and they need to have murals for their wonderful new buildings. So of course they set up a competition, and it is the JJ school that wins the competition. So it is artists from the JJ school, contemporaries of people like Jagannath Ahivasi and other artists who go up to Delhi to make those murals. And then later in London, there's another competition for Bombay, for India House, and then it's Shanti Niketan, it's Bengal school artists that so this is again the kind of milieu out of which we then find the emigres entering into India. So I would push back slightly on the idea that without them we wouldn't have a modern or contemporary art scene in India. We may not have a modern and contemporary art scene in the fashion that we see it today. Certainly their nurturing of Ara, Raza was important. But then the question becomes, how important is Ara to the development of modern and contemporary art in our context? In my opinion, not very. I think that the work is interesting. The work at its moment is of a certain caliber. Does it push things? Does it push ideas ahead substantially? Not really. Raza's gone by 1950. He's no longer in India to make a difference to the local arts ecosystem. So again, what is the tangible difference in terms of, you know, conversations over coffees, conversations at the art galleries or at dinner tables? Limited, I would say. So I think that we need to be careful also about more generally the way that the Progressive Artists Group is treated in terms of the influence they then have over what happened subsequently in the late 50s and early 60s. We've talked many times about the Bullabhai Desai Institute today. I would say it's a space like that which becomes the crucible for conversation and discourse going into the 60s.
No, 100%. And often, as I learned from people I interviewed, that post watching a show, they would go over to Leyden or Mulk Raj Anand's house and continue these conversations. There's this idea of two Bombays always existing, right? There is the fantastic Bombay, which in a way we're still talking about that Bombay, and then there was the other Bombay. How did one negotiate this period? And it still exists.
What was very established by then was the JJ School of Art. Since we're talking about Rudy von Leyden in particular today, I'll stick to that. So the Bombay Art School was there. And there were principles like Dandavate Mat, there were principles like Ahivasi, there were principles like Palshikar. These were forces to reckon with. I don't want to enter into a realm where I don't know what their thoughts were, but they definitely held their own. And it was not just these 6 artists and then later on each of them inviting someone else to join. So there definitely was something happening in the city. 2 Bombays, if you like to call it, 2 art worlds. It was the same in theatre. INT had been established by then, Indian National Theatre. And then you had a third maverick, Adi Marasban. All the Parsis in this room will remember Adi Marasban. Adi Marasban was no less. He went to the Pasadena School of Acting, and he really studied drama over there. And yet he came back and adapted to farce, you know, Parsi farce, for want of a better word. I mean, Meher is sitting here. She's done a whole book on Parsi theatre. And so there were all these multiples existing. But today the topic is your book. and Rudi. So, and these three German gentlemen. It was fortuitous. It was that time. I don't think we can do it again. They were debarred from doing any of this in their own country. They were interned in camps in Bombay. I think Schlesinger and his wife were separated. He was in a men's internment camp, and she was in another. And I think Rudi or someone played a role in getting them.
Rudi, he showed them Walter Langhammer's satirical sketches
of Hitler,
and said that
they're not pro-Hitler, they're actually anti-Hitler. So there were lots of levels, you know, in which this was happening. And Bullabai and the PAG was one level. Al-Qazi did something completely, by the mid-60s, he was gone. He was gone to Delhi to start the National School of Drama.
And Sousa, of course, was gone.
Sousa had gone to the US.
49,
Yes.
Can I ask Rima a question? In fact, there's a quote in the book where in 1962, I think Sousa has an exhibition. He comes back to India, and there's an exhibition. And Rudy von Leyden, of course, is as you've said, is the art critic, the Times of India, and there's a quote you have about a particular work of Sousa's, which von Leyden finds problematic in some fashion. Perhaps you could tell us about that painting. And my question is, do you think by the 60s, von Leyden's own taste, his innate taste, was being challenged itself by the kinds of work that artists who he was championing in the late 40s and early 50s had in a sense moved beyond his own tastes by the 1960s?
So this particular, it was a letter to the editor actually. The art critic had praised Sousa's work and said it was a work of genius.
What was the work? Just
I can't recall.
Okay, I think it was a big nude.
And he said that, I don't think this is a work of genius, and your art critic has gone a bit too far. And he's like, I know Sousa, and I've known his earlier work, and I have been in touch with him. And I know this intense need to provoke. And this comes from that. And if you ask me, he's created some of the finest drawings and paintings. But this in particular work, 1963 work, is not a work of genius. And perhaps I think the way I saw it, one could see when an artist is coming from a sincere space versus, indulging in a gimmick, where there was, and Krishan Khanna was someone I turned to often because he is the last surviving modernist and knew all of these artists, and he sparked the idea to write this book essentially. And corroborated that there is this need to every now and then to provoke the audience and announce himself. Yeah.
Because it seems to me that a lot of the PAG group was engaged in this idea of almost retrospectively creating a mythology about themselves, of this clean break from before themselves to what happened pre-independence to what happens post-independence. But my reading of it is that really that only happens once they're long gone from India.
No, and it's always in hindsight.
In hindsight. And they were just lucky that most of them lived so long. I mean, Sousa and Hussein, outlive anyone else from their generation.
True, and this is something Dadiba Pandole had shared with me, that he was an artist that survived, that loved a good ego massage. And he didn't find that in New York, and that broke him a little. And then subsequently, there was turmoil in his personal life, and it kind of started reflecting in his work as well. But he always knew he was special.
I was lucky to work with Air India when they started collecting the paintings under Mr. Jal Kawasji. And this is one person who needs to be recognized as a person who really uh, spearheaded the commercial aspect of buying paintings to put them into a very special space because of an international audience that they could reach. And he did a lot of work to take these paintings to all the booking offices that we had at that time. We were opening booking offices almost like, every few months there would be another one being opened. I worked with them in 1954, and I was very lucky to be taken to art exhibitions. First thing in the morning, I would be told, you go and see the exhibition, and in the evening, Mr. Kawasji would come, and he would discuss which ones do you think are worth looking at. And he would then train me to see art, and because he had a very special eye. Mr. Kuka then would, after Mr. Kawasji approved of those, would then be the one who would sanction the money. And sometimes Mr. G.R.D. Tata would also be consulted. But by and large, it was Air India's need to reach out to various audiences abroad and take Indian art as a commercial enterprise. Not that they were being bought or sold or in that way, but it was something very special that Air India did at that time. And I think this whole movement of Hussain, because we took his wooden toys, as they were called, and I remember creating a whole mural with them for the Geneva office. There was a whole mural. You have the photograph, and I was instrumental in creating this mural with the toys. And there were so many things that we did with the artist's work.
Did Hussain go to Geneva for the setup, or you did it in his absence?
No, I just visited the Geneva office on my first trip abroad, because with Air India, if you worked for 1 year, you got a free trip. And so on that trip, I went to Rome, and then to Paris, and to Geneva on my way back. So, I mean, the thing was that there was something so fantastic that Air India was doing. Later on, of course, Prabha and other artists, we used Prabha's work for all the menu cards, the wine lists, and the amount of work that was taken from the artists, and they benefited because Air India was the one source for them to sell, and Mr. Kawasji is the one person who encouraged even contemporary, much later artists in Gujarat, Shanti Dave, Bhatt, all those artists were encouraged by Air India.
That's right.
They were not even known at that time.
That's
so I think that somewhere hats off to Air India.
It goes back to what we were saying about soft power, and
Right.
it was just an absolutely ideal moment in time.
Mort, I was just thinking about what you said around the progressive artist groups and their contribution were they catalysts to another imagination today? And I would like to think about how the diaspora that the Shoah, the Holocaust, created across various geographies, because people actually moved away, Jews and others, to places like Mexico or Brazil or Egypt, Algeria, and they created also, like when you go to the Venice Biennale right now, you see a lot of people who have moved across to South America or to Africa or to North America, and they've created kind of artistic movements. And these movements are kind of progressive, and these movements also, like with the progressive artist groups and their relationship to the progressive writers group, and their kind of contesting of nationalism, also the nation state. Because sometimes I feel if they weren't there and people like Rudi weren't catalysts to this imagination, we would have actually fallen into this abyss of abstraction that is very, very nationalist, like the Palshikar school, and what we see today as abstraction that is produced in the JJ School of Art and everything is kind of very nationalist, Hindu, it's an abyss. And so I really feel that that pushback at that moment allows people like Atul Lodya and others to, arrive and produce really interesting work in figuration later on. And I think so then Rudi's kind of inheritance is interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And Sonal Kula, an academic in the States, has written a book not so long ago called Worldly Affiliation. Sorry, it's not. She's using the idea of worldly affiliation, which is basically that beyond state-level coordination and communication, there are these sort of bubbles of networks. We've talked about Air India, we've talked about other emigres. It's these cross-national networks that really become influential in carrying conversations across borders. So I totally understand and agree with the sentiment. My only point is that I feel JJ School within its own barriers and constraints to being progressive had enough of an impetus ultimately to get us to a point of contemporaneity. And I think that regardless of the emigres, we would have had some kind of moment of the contemporary, what it would have looked like. It could have been skewed, as you say, Sumesh. Yeah.
And it's interesting because the professors at the JJ School of Art would often tell their students not to mix with the progressives. Don't mix with these fellows because they are in touch with these three foreigners who God knows putting what in their minds. So in fact, chapter 3, the title is Don't Mix with the Fellows, with these fellows. Right. So yeah.
Rima, this was a fascinating conversation. I can't wait to read the book.
Thank you.
You know, in response, when you're sort of reminiscing about the past, it's difficult not to reflect a little bit also on the future. And I'm just wondering here, and I know that the question that you asked Firoza about what was that time like and why was it different, and I think Firoza's response was something to do, it was the artists. And I think somewhere there is this whole phase where it seems like access to the artist community, to poets, to to literati, to just visual artists was sort of prolific and easy. And while Mott, I know you referred to this whole aspect of the gallery and the relationship, the hierarchical sort of feudal relationship that otherwise could exist. But somewhere I feel, are we missing that in the current context? Has commerce sort of overtaken that in some form? I'd just love to get the panel's comment on that. And I don't know if that's a bit of a derailment from your, from a focus on the book, but.
I think one of the things that I find, there are many, the pros and cons of social media, but one of the pros that I find of social media is that it has really democratized conversation. And, it's interesting to see, what is the role of the critic, for instance, when everyone in this room, has their phone, has their Instagram, can walk into an art gallery and, share their opinion on it. So I think from that point of view, I think the conversation has opened up. I don't know if others want to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, I totally accept the point that I think commerce has, in a sense, created the conditions where there is a mediation which has become necessary in the conversation between artists and collectors in that transactional mode. Whether or not that has equally made social interaction difficult, perhaps it has as a unfortunate byproduct or consequence. The question is whether we would prefer to have a situation where galleries are not able to protect the interests of artists and where there's oftentimes this some exploitation is a strong word, but I think in our own history in the city there have been moments, Firoza, please weigh in, where artists have been used in not necessarily the most gratifying ways by collectors. So it's I agree. We lose one to gain the other. We gain one to lose the other.
I'm just going to spend 1 minute and then hand over the mic to someone in the audience. In Akshay, I think whether it's the artist or the collector, or the corporate house, or the person who's bidding in an auction. My take is, please educate yourself. The artists, the progressives, really educated themselves, and wherever they did not educate themselves, they were willing to listen and open their minds to somebody who was trying to tell them something which was not in their sphere of what was happening in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So I think even today, education of everybody who wants to be in the arts, whether it's theatre, learn about the new forms of theatre, whether it's in the art school. I think art schools are also opening up a lot. We have painters like Ghulam Ahmad Sheikh, who does, and Bhupen Kakkar out of Baroda. And it was it's a revelation what happened there. And here we have Atul and Jitesh and even Rini Dhumal, who's exhibited over here. So I think the answer is, wherever you go, you really need to educate yourself, and it's not just commerce. And I feel sorry for artists who are exploited. They don't need to be, and they have a mind of their own, and they have to stand up and express their opinion. And some of it may be palatable, some of it may not be palatable, exactly like what Sousa did. That didn't make him a pauper or anything like that. He made good he made good commercial sense, you know, even if he was a maverick and provoking, his work sold. So I think you really need to educate yourself, whichever way you go, in whichever genre you're moving in, because they're bad plays and they're good plays, and they're thought-provoking plays and they're not so much thought-provoking. And in there.
This is a very small sideline, and it was a very temporary thing. My husband was advertising manager for Standard Vacuum Oil Company. And this was the period, do you remember the company calendars that everybody was waiting for? Well, he found the calendars produced by the company atrocious. And he started going to art galleries and collecting art, good art, and trying to convince people to print that. And for 2 years, they had a wonderful collection. People like Rawal, let's see who else was there, Shavaks Chowda, and Sawant, Al-Milkar, not so well known, but these calendars were quite beautiful, and people wanted them, and then it died out. But it was a very brief, late 50s movement where companies then started competing, trying to get artwork.
In fact, we talked about the Air India
calendars, yeah. And in fact, 1977, once Rudi left Bombay in 1968, his first trip to India after a decade was sponsored by Air India, and they invited him to curate a calendar of Ganjifa cards. So, yes. So Air India calendars were also sought after, yeah.
And of course, you know, where else were you going to see modern and contemporary art in the city? We're in, obviously, the bastion of, well, supposed bastion of modern art in the NGMA. Well, this only came into, it was only showing from the 80s onwards. And as a collecting institution, even in Delhi, it really hadn't built a major collection. So it was spaces like calendars where one could actually see what was going on. Over to the boss.
Thank you so much for this very insightful conversation. I wonder what Avid would have been at that point in time. Mike. But no, thank you for this discussion. And Agasanti, you know, we did a lot of work when the Air India collection was exhibited at the NGMA, and lots of what you were talking about was there, including the Dali ashtray. But thank you, Rima, for skillfully, you know, anchoring this discussion around your passionate book. Thank you, Mrs. Godrej, you, Mort, and thank you to our audiences for being here in such numbers, and to our partners, the National Gallery of Modern Art, Mr. Umesh Kumar Rastogi, Shruti, Bombay for your partnership. At Avid, we have lots more programs coming up. In fact, we're launching a new series next week it's not a new series, it's a revised series on urban legacies, looking at the precincts of Bombay, and we're going to be looking at Shivaji Park. That's going to be across the road at the Kumaraswamy Hall. We also have a workshop on AI and law on Saturday, and lots more interesting things coming up. So do stay tuned, stalk us on social media, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.